now I can open this well. So I say thank you.
Simona, just excuse me, but I need just to inform you that this section will be recorded.
Okay.
If you have some problems, your image to be disseminated in the YouTube, because most probably will be in the YouTube, you just turn on your camera, okay? I think I will ask everyone to turn off the microphone also. And by the end of Simona's lecture, we will open a period for debate. Okay? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. Well, you see the title of my talk here in the PowerPoint presentation. First of all, I'm going to explain the title. What does it mean that the challenge of an ethics directed beyond humans risks to be trivialized, and why is it extremely important that we don't trivialize it? Well, I will answer very, very briefly, very quickly. There is the risk to trivialize such an issue because it's quite obvious, because it's easy to transform it into a simply rhetorical issue composed of empty words. So all speak about environment, all speak about climate change, about a change in our attitudes, behaviors, and so on. And at the same time, it is extremely important that this doesn't happen. So it's extremely important that we don't trivialize this problem, this challenge, so that we really develop ourselves in an ethical way towards the environment, because it may be the only way, in my opinion, to face the environmental crisis we are living. In order to explain these first almost catastrophic sentences, okay, I take a step back, starting from the environmental crisis and the way in which we, as humanity, reacted so far. When I use the word environmental crisis, I refer to a set of several crises that you all already know. So climate change, plastic pollution, loss of biodiversity, melting of the glaciers, and so on. All phenomena which represent a challenge for humanity and for the planet. But this challenge is not only a challenge because it is a danger for us, but I would say that it is also a moral challenge, an ethical challenge for every one of us, because it's a kind of challenge that doesn't belong, I would say, to the sphere of ethics and ethical decisions to which we are normally used. So it is something completely new for us. And this may explain the reason why we don't do enough to respond to such a problem, to such a challenge. So the questions which arise immediately are these that you can read. Why all this? So why, or better, which is the peculiarity of this environmental challenge we are living? Which are the reasons, first of all, why we don't do enough to respond? Well, I have tried to summarize an answer on the base of this book that you see here. It's an Italian book. I don't think that there exists the English translation. The English translation of the title would be Ecological Denial or Ecological Negation: Why We Know Everything About the Environmental Emergency and Yet Pretend Nothing is Happening. It's a very interesting book in which the author, Paolo Vidali, lists several reasons why indeed we don't do anything or we don't do enough. First of all, as I have written, it's difficult for us to understand this crisis as a real problem and as a real emergency. And this is because it is an emergency, so the environmental emergency is an emergency whose consequences will become fully visible only in the long term. And as human organism, we are not really equipped, I would say, to perceive challenges and emergencies that develop over a long time. By definition, in fact, an emergency requires a rapid response, so a rapid answer, a rapid reaction. And from an evolutionary point of view, from a biological point of view, the reaction that human beings have always had to face an emergency is the emotion of fear. We normally react to the true emergencies with fear. Unfortunately, however, the fact that the consequences of the environmental crisis appear only over a long time implies that we never truly experience the kind of fear that would oblige us, so to say, to react immediately. And in this regard, evolutionary psychology speaks about evolutionary impasse. So we are in a sort of impasse regarding our adaptation to our habitat, biological habitat, the whole planet Earth. Because in the course of our evolution, we have created a situation that is very problematic, even for our own adaptation, but we cannot perceive this situation as a problematic one. So we know it is problematic, and yet it is as if we didn't know it. It is as if this awareness struggled to translate into determined and immediate actions. We don't feel a true emotion of fear. We can say that. While this, so a second why, while this, also, in this case, I use Vidali's book in order to list some reasons. As you can read, we have several reasons. Most of them are cognitive, so psychological reasons. For example, reason number one, we are used to perceiving individual things and objects, whereas the environmental crisis requires a relational and interconnected vision. So we don't have this relational vision. We are not used to seeing the world in an holistic way, in a relational way, in an ecological way. Or reason number two, we find it difficult to think in terms of discontinuity, in the sense that we tend to take for granted that nature will always behave in a regular way and fail to recognize that an epochal change is underway, is real. Or another reason, we tend to think through improper generalizations, whereas the environmental crisis is a slow process that can be investigated mainly at a statistical level. So this has to do with our conception of science and scientific method. Or another reason, our brain is not equipped. So you see, it's a matter of brain, it's a biological and physiological matter. Our brain is not equipped to deal with a threat that is low, cumulative, and global, like, for example, the climate change, which is an emergency that is out of scale, both spatially and temporally. Or once again, we tend to think of ourselves as individuals, or at most as groups or states, whereas we have never learned to think of ourselves as a species, nor to imagine the possible disappearance of the human species as a whole. So, as you can see, there are several psychological and biological reasons why we don't react properly to the crisis we are living. And even if we turn to the tradition of moral philosophy, we don't find much help. I'm sorry to say this because it's my discipline. In other words, even if we try to leave aside all these physiological and cognitive limitations and turn to the philosophical tradition in search of a clear moral principle that could help us as a kind of guiding star in these uncertain times we are living, well, we struggle to find such a principle. In fact, traditionally, ethics has always focused on relationships among human beings, on relations among existing persons, while it has rarely considered our responsibilities toward future generations, and even less our relationship with non-human nature. And you can understand this is a problem, a problematic situation, a problematic condition, because if we look closely, well, it is precisely future generations and non-human nature that are most at risk and that require more protection because of the environmental crisis of our times. Now, in this regard, I want to specify that contemporary moral philosophy in the past few decades, so in recent years, has been working to restructure its conceptual framework in order to justify the inclusion of future generations and the non-human within the moral sphere. It's the so-called environmental ethics debate. But you can understand that this represents a sort of philosophical revolution, an ethical revolution in the context of our tradition, Western tradition, which is an anthropocentric and individualistic tradition that is focused on relationships among human individuals. So even though philosophy is working on this, has been working on this, well, we certainly cannot say that there is a long-standing philosophical tradition ready to come to our aid and give suggestion in relation to our problem. And this is an important problem in my opinion. And this is not the last problem, because actually there is a third one. So there is yet another issue. That is the fact that we don't understand how our small individual contribution can make a difference to such a global problem. So this is a sort of, I would say, a sort of logical problem within the environmental problem, a problem inside the problem. This is the so-called collective action issue, because on the one hand, we all know that every one of us can contribute. Every one of us can do their own part. But on the other hand, my single contribution on its own changes nothing. So I am important and I am not important. I said it's a sort of logical contradiction within the solution we can give as individual humans. So you can see that even when we think about it, the moral urgency of our action becomes quite, I would say, confused, which risk producing a sort of sense of moral helplessness, one that can easily lead us to give up on our good intentions. So often we don't have good intentions. Also, when we have good intentions, at the end we say, well, I cannot do anything. I'm not of use, and I give up. To illustrate this, and this is also a psychological matter, of course, to illustrate this, I will use a rather vivid example suggested by the environmental philosopher Del Jamison, professor of environmental philosophy at the University of New York. Jamison offers the following scenario. He says, right, imagine that Jack steals Jill's bicycle, okay? An act that is obviously morally negative. But consider the difference between these cases that I have listed in the slide. Case number one, Jack intentionally steals Jill's bicycle. Case number two, Jack is part of a group of strangers, each of whom takes a piece of Jill's bicycle until it disappears. Case number three, Jack takes pieces from several bicycles, one of which belongs to Jill. 4. Jack and Jill live on different continents, and Jill's loss is the result of a chain of events initiated by Jack. Case number 5. Jack lives many centuries before Jill and consumes materials essential for making bicycles, so Jill will never have a bike. Number 6, acting independently, Jack and many other strangers set in motion a chain of events that prevents a large number of people who live in the future in another region of the world from ever getting a bicycle? Well, as Demison suggests, the first scenario is the one most suited to moral evaluation, whereas in the sixth scenario, in the last scenario, it's difficult to clearly identify the moral agents and the causal link between the agents and the victims. But the problem is, this is precisely the scenario that is most closely, or better, that most closely resembles, is similar to the environmental crisis we are living. Because we can still talk about moral responsibility, because we are informed about the consequences of our actions, but the fact that it is unintentional, shared with many others, and spatially and temporally distant, diminishes the moral weight of our actions, which again undermines our motivation. So, to summarize, I would say this: we know there is a huge problem, but we struggle to act because we have difficulty defining and circumscribing the problem. We feel that it doesn't concern us personally, or that we cannot do anything about it. In any case, it is hard to engage with the problem because it doesn't involve present tangible subjects. And if we look for support in our moral tradition, we find little help, at least not immediately. In short, we know there is a problem, and we know that we could do our part because we are constantly told so. However, we remain, so to speak, stuck in its resolution, blocked, so to say, in its resolution, as if, regarding climate change and environmental problems, our will lacked bite, lacked energy, not able both to internalize a genuine moral feeling and to follow a moral principle. So we are blocked, as said. And so, after saying this, which direction should we look in? Should we give up? Of course, this is not my conclusion. It seems to me that in such a radical situation, gradualism and moderation probably won't help. In other words, facing a radical challenge requires a radical anthropological revolution. We cannot, of course, magically change our physiological and psychological predispositions, but as human beings, we can ask ourselves what we want to become, what we want to recognize as meaningful, and how we want to cultivate new aspects of ourselves. And I think that in asking these questions, we need to think big. We need to imagine a new idea of what it means to be human indeed. By saying this, I'm not referring to post-human hybridation or something like that. So I'm not going so far, or at least not in this context. But rather, I am simply referring to human beings who are willing to admit that they are living a new story and who are ready to construct an horizon of meaning and purpose in their life that is consistent with this new story. What does it mean? Well, this means to give up the search for analogies with past emergencies or situations. And from an ethical, philosophical point of view, it means to abandon the need to maintain strict continuity with the anthropocentrism of traditional ethics, or more in general, of Western tradition. And here we see again the importance of ethics. And here we see again the reason why we cannot trivialize the idea of an environmental ethics, as said in the title. Because it is not just something interesting for us, but the fact of acting ethically towards the environment, it may be something necessary, maybe the last solution we have to face the environmental crisis. So I don't want to sound alarmist because I am not alarmist, okay? But we have to admit that other approaches, other perspectives haven't worked. In fact, we have already seen that thinking only in instrumental terms, that is, in terms of what protects ourselves, doesn't lead to meaningful results, because we cannot fully grasp the problem and we cannot act consistently. So, all the more, perhaps, we should take a different path, a path that in some sense is more radical, a path that focuses on redefining what has meaning and value for us, an ethical path, indeed. Summarizing, I would say that the problem we are confronting now is this, very briefly. How can we become more responsible in the face of the environmental emergency? I would summarize the new question in this question. Notice that the word responsibility is crucial. There is a problem, and we must take responsibility for addressing this problem. We have seen that focusing only on the problem doesn't take us very far, so it hasn't worked. So let's try to think about the concept of responsibility. What does it mean to be responsible towards the world, towards nature, towards the environment, and so on? Well, of course, there are different meanings of the word responsibility. For example, the legal meaning. From an ethical perspective, I will rely on the conception of the famous philosopher Jonas, who in 1979 published the work The Principle of Responsibility. Here on the slide you see the Italian version, Principio Responsabilità, Principle of Responsibility, in which he starts precisely from a problem which is similar to our problem. In fact, Jonas states that contemporary humans have the power to affect the life of all humanity, especially future generations and the entire planet. Therefore, he writes, we need a new ethics based on foresight and based on the notion of responsibility, which is understood by Jonas, first of all, as feeling responsible for, and I underline the word feeling, and learning to take care for, or to care for. And in this respect, Jonas gives the example of a mother's relationship to her child. What does responsibility imply? Or better, what does this definition of responsibility imply? What are its necessary conditions? What are its necessary elements? Jonas once again gives us some indications. The first indication is the moral principle, moral rational principle, you can read here. Act in such a way that the consequences of your action are compatible with the continuation of authentic human life on earth. So this is a reinterpretation of Immanuel Kant's ethical principle. But I wouldn't focus on this principle because it is not enough. So using reason, so to say, in order to develop responsibility is not enough, because other elements are needed. The three elements I have listed below. First element, fragility and vulnerability, actual or potential, of what we feel responsible for. If we didn't perceive this vulnerability, we wouldn't be called to feel responsible. I could think, for example, of the mother and the child example. The mother feels, that the child is vulnerable. Of course, I love my daughter too. She is 25 today, so I love her, but she's not so vulnerable as she was a newborn baby, of course. And if I go to her and I tell her you are vulnerable, she tell me, okay, but I don't need you in this moment. Thank you very much. I'm not so vulnerable. So think about the example of the mother with the newborn baby. Number 2, psychological and emotional permeability, which allows us to feel, so not to understand, but to feel once again, the appeal arising from the fragility of the external object, which is fundamental for this appeal to receive a response. In other words, this is what we normally call empathy, which is another fundamental assumption for the sense of responsibility. So, according to Jonas, in order to have responsibility, we need feelings, we need emotions, we need empathy. And what does it mean? Precisely to feel this appeal from something external. Jonas says that it means recognizing the intrinsic value of that something. That is, recognizing that that something matters, so is important also beyond its usefulness to us. So it means to recognize that it deserves to exist as such and not merely as a means to other ends. So if I didn't recognize the value of this something, okay, I couldn't truly feel responsible, because my responsibility in this case would always be imposed externally, and therefore it wouldn't be authentic. It would be a sort of inauthentic copy of the true responsibility. So, based on Jonas' reflections, you can see how the concept of value is crucial and indispensable for having responsibility. So, I would say that they are really closely intertwined. Hence, returning to our topic, we can see that in order to work on our responsibility regarding the climate and environmental crisis, we need to work on our horizon of value, and we need to expand this horizon of value. Let me clarify. Think about this. What do we recognize, or what can we recognize as having authentic value, intrinsic value, value as such? There are several possibilities. We can attribute value, as you see, to our own utility, obvious, or we can attribute value to other human beings, consistently with the Western ethical tradition, or we can attribute value to other human beings not yet born, so who are not born yet, so the future generations. And here we already start to have problems because we are not used to thinking of ourselves as good ancestors. So we had good parents, good grandparents, good friends, but good ancestors is difficult for us, even if it's not entirely strange, it's not entirely counterintuitive, since the criterion is still anthropocentric, so future generations are still humans. And finally, we can attribute value to the other than human, so biodiversity and the environment. And in this case, well, we really begin to struggle, in my opinion, because we are familiar with valuing human beings, of course. We are familiar with valuing and caring for an animal. We are familiar with feeling empathy for our cat or our dog, first of all, if they are very sweet, okay? But what does it mean to feel empathy for biodiversity such and the environment? It's not so easy for us. Well, if we look closely, all these bearers of value that I have listed, so that I have just mentioned, are in some way affected by the environmental crisis, and consequently, they are all potential starting points for reflecting on our horizon of value. In fact, personally, so as humans in the present, we already begin to feel the changes, for example, in the rise of summer temperatures or in the frequency of floods. And I know that in Portugal you have had many problems recently. So we already know, we start to leave the problems concerning the environmental crisis. As for other humans, We know that there are people in other parts of the world who lives, or rather, whose lives, sorry, are already changed and damaged by these environmental problems. So, for example, think about the so-called climate migrations. As for future generations, well, all we know that future generations will be the ones most affected, for example, by climate change, but in general by the environmental crisis and by the environmental problems. And then there is the planet Earth. There is biodiversity, there is environment, with all its non-human components. And we know that the planet Earth already shows important signs of serious distress. So consider ocean acidification, glacial melting, biodiversity loss, and so on. We have said that all the subjects who are victims of the environmental crisis are possible bearers of value toward which our sense of responsibility can be directed. And we have said that the last level, so the level of the non-human, is the most difficult to recognize in its value, which is another way to say that it is harder to think we should feel responsible and to act responsibly toward the planet, toward the ecosystem, toward the biodiversity, and so on. Exactly for this reason, okay, I propose to start from this level. Because, as said, I propose to face the challenge, to change the crisis, to change the difficult time we are living in big, so to say, through an anthropological change of ourselves, through a radical change of ourselves, which means to be willing to go beyond the humans and to be willing to think about the possibility of acting responsibly, indeed, for the planet, for the good of the planet, and for all the species, at least, who live in the planet. And now the question is, of course, but is it possible? Because speaking is easy, and we have to understand if we really can do this, if we really can change this way. Is it possible, and how can we do it? Because we have said that it's enough, and it's not enough to think or say yes, because emotions, empathy, and feeling are all dimensions of ourselves that we cannot command at will. In this respect, I would say that there are good news, okay? Several good news, and also in this case, I have tried to list the good news. First of all, as you can read, biologists and psychologists have been studying the concept of biophilia for years. And starting from the concept of biophilia, they say that, yes, it is possible to develop a true sense of responsibility, a true empathy towards the environment. Here is a brief summary of what biophilia is. Well, literally, biophilia means love of life or love of living things. The concept was already discussed in the 80s by the American biologist Edward Wilson and has been empirically investigated by several authors, including Italian scholar Giuseppe Barbiero, who is a biologist, or Rita Berto, who is an ecopsychologist. Wilson's definition is as follows. Biophilia is the innate tendency of humans to focus attention on living forms and everything that surrounds them, and in some cases to affiliate with them emotionally. More succinctly, in the book of Barbiero and Berto, biophilia is defined as the phylogenetically determined predisposition of humans to feel compassion for non-human creatures. So, not only animals, but all non-human creatures. So, in summary, these authors tell us that biophilia is an innate emotional and behavioral pattern, a pattern that originates in human evolution, so it is encoded in our genes, a pattern that can bring with it an empathetic and emotional attachment to living nature. Here we see the theme of feeling, which is so important to our discussion. A pattern that can be cultivated in humans precisely because humans are naturally predisposed to this empathy toward the non-human. And I say this is not simply a beautiful thought, a philosophical thought, an hypothesis, but it is a scientific position confirmed by scientific experiments. So I would say this is good news. Another good news concerns the possibility of cultivating biophilia. Because unlike humans who live on the other side of the world, so unlike future generations, nature and the non-human are always around us. We have nature around us somehow, which makes it possible for every one of us to develop and nurture and cultivate a different sense of affiliation and belonging toward nature, toward environment. So it's not impossible. It is enough that we change our gaze toward the environment and toward the world around us. And finally, another good piece of news is that this relationship of affiliation and valuing nature, so the sense of belonging that we can cultivate and which goes hand in hand with our sense of responsibility, is not experienced as a sacrifice, or at least is not necessarily experienced as a sacrifice, because on the contrary, it brings, or it may bring well-being to us, both physical and psychological, as many doctors also confirm, probably because it involves a natural predisposition which is already present in us from our biological and evolutionary history. So you can see how this path, which, well, apparently is a radical path and a strange, counterintuitive path, actually is the most practicable part. Okay, so from an I would say from an evolutionary perspective, we are not predisposed to grasp the environmental problem directly, but always from an evolutionary perspective, we are predisposed to change our relationship with the non-human and consequently to act responsibly toward the environment and non-human life. In other words, the conditions for an experiential anthropological change exist, okay? And they are conditions that humans can consciously work on within the framework, let's say, of a reorganization of our horizon of meaning and value. This, in turn, can be a good starting point for acting more responsibly toward the natural balance in which we are embedded, since it is precisely the lack of this sense of responsibility that has brought about the environmental crisis we are currently facing, even if sometimes we cannot acknowledge it as a crisis. So thank you very much for your attention and for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Simona, for this very stimulating presentation. It brings a lot of of ideas and a lot of issues to be discussed. Well, we can go through many different directions, I think. Well, I would like to open the floor to questions for the debate. So I will invite, first of all, students to join with questions, to some provocations if it is the case, or whatever. So I already see Madalena with the hand raised. So please, Madalena, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Simona because it was a really good presentation, and
thank you very much
for all the information. I wanted to ask you if environmental education is not the pathway in order for us to create this emotional feeling in society to change and to understand the environmental importance. So basically, the importance of environmental education in order to create this feeling and this connected to nature.
Well, yes, I would say that environmental education is the answer. Okay, well, I am not an expert in environmental education in practical terms, but I would say this is the first answer, and maybe the unique answer. Of course, we have to understand and interpret the word education in many senses. So education can be the education to adults, to teenagers, to elderly, no matter, all is education. But I think that first of all, the most important education is the education of children, because children, are at the beginning of their emotions, so to say, can be educated from their origin to a new way of feeling, to a new way of thinking, but not only thinking the world, but I would say also to seeing the world with different eyes, and seeing the world with different eyes goes always in parallel with a new way of valuing the world. So, well, the education is the answer. Practically, what can we do? As said, I am not the expert. I can simply say what I see in all my colleagues, among whom Maria, Antonella, and so on, who are experts in environmental education. I see, for example, the importance of outdoor activities with students at the university, outdoor activity with adults, and I think also outdoor activities with children. I have read about many experiments done with children. It really seems that an education done in nature changes the way in which children internalize, so to say, the way in which they feel responsible indeed toward the world, and not only toward human beings. So some exponents of environmental ethics tell us, maybe they are too optimistic, I don't know, but tell us that the sense of belonging to a natural community is the next step after the sense of belonging towards humanity. So some centuries ago, it was a dream to think that humans would feel a sense of community with all other human beings. Today, it's not a dream, or better, practically it's a dream, but theoretically, at least, it's normal for us to think, yes, of course, there is a human community because all humans have human rights. Well, some authors of environmental ethics say the next step is to recognize the natural community based on the ecological relationships connected all of us. So we can think it's possible, we can hope that it's possible. The notion of biophilia gives us good news, as said.
Well, we could go through the environmental education because it is a big issue also, and there are many different ways of doing environmental education. And just don't forget that we, the word "we" is also something that we could talk about, where we talk a lot about we, but who are we? It's important also to think about that. But I would say that environmental education in Western regions are already more than 40 years. And so we would say that people with 40 years now, being children at 40 years ago, would have a different attitude and behavior. And we found out that they have not. So we need also to rethink about that idea of working with children for once, and for the other, how have we done environmental education? But I would not like to go through that direction because we are with the ethics. But we can, Madalena and others, we can then make a forum on that also. I would open also for other questions. José, please.
Hello, good afternoon. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, perfectly.
I would like to propose a small question. Behind environmental education, and considering the theme of this seminar, I would like to ask, consider the ethic applied to sustainability and environmental education. I see all days a problem considered in industry. We have a problem with the industry all over the world, but considered in Portugal, in Italy, all over Europe, which is the problem in a correct project of sustainability, and a correct project to apply and to to do all things right behind the legislation of each country, and what I see in the ground, what actually happens. Not always the things are doing properly and to respect the environment and the sustainability project. So the question is, in the future, with the new generations, how can we solve this problem for once? Is there a big view so we can see it the long term?
$1 million question.
Yeah, it's a small question.
Yeah.
A big introduction with a small question.
Yeah.
And then I do not see an answer.
Well, can I try to answer? But of course, it's not an answer. Well, I would say that there are many words, okay, about this, about a better future, a sustainable future, and so on. But we all know that things are not changing so much. So there are many projects, but practically things don't change. So politically things don't change, and from an economical point of view, things are not changing, or not enough. Okay, at least. That's why I focus on and I insist on ethics. And when I speak about ethics, I don't intend ethics related to politics directly, but I intend ethics related to the single individuals. Because I think that if single individuals really change their mind, their experience, and so on, also politics, also economy, all has to change. Another example, if now we had a government, at least here in our Western tradition, a government or an industry or so on, who kill people, for example, okay, we would do, I think, a revolution. So it is impossible, okay, that a government here in the Western tradition or an industry kill people for their own interest. And why? Because, okay, thanks to an old tradition, Western tradition, and so on, human beings have value for us. So this is taken for granted. Okay, there are many contradictions, but it is theoretically taken for granted. Maybe we can take a step forward and we can reach a similar assumption also in relation to the no-human. So, for example, there are authors of environmental ethics, but not only environmental ethics, who say, and it's true, some centuries ago, it was normal for Western people to think that there were slaves in their country. Okay, it was legal, it was normal. Now slavery is not legal anymore. In the whole world, it exists again, we know, but it is not legal anymore. So maybe slowly we can reach through a change of our anthropological insight and so on. We can reach a similar respect towards the environment, and if we get this goal, maybe also economy, politics, and so on will be obliged, so to change gradually, okay, their directions, their decisions. But I don't think it is possible to start from the upper point. It's better maybe to start from the basis. History has often changed this way.
I think it's a global problem.
Of course.
Just a last question, because in Europe we have environmental education, at least in the European countries, or European Union countries. We have environmental education, we have projects of industrial sustainability and all over that. But I think in China we don't have that. I think in Indonesia we don't have that. I think in Brazil we have 50% of that.
Yes, but in Brazil, it's a different question because there is a deep culture in relation to NATO. So it's another.
The question is, in the global perspective, the problems that we see in Europe, and we consider it from an ethic perspective, there are many other countries who don't see it that way and don't consider it that way. So the vision we have, it's different considering the country in we are.
Yes, I don't have the global solution, unfortunately.
I
don't have
the
global solution. Well, I think that's
this is a reflective question to think about.
No, please. Sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, I was saying this does not have an answer. It's something to think about it and to reflect about it, but in a middle term, this not have an answer, a proper one, an answer to solve it.
Absolutely not, because as said to Maddalena, education is an important point of this change, and education, of course, concerns all individuals, but needs to be supported. And in such country you mentioned, it's not supported in environmental sense. So I really don't have the solution. But I'm not optimistic actually, but I think that we have all natural and environmental roots. Okay, I don't speak about universal category or something like that, but all we have environmental roots. And so I think that, I said, all of us have an intrinsic tendency to go towards nature. So I hope that maybe in all culture, this tendency, this need to reach nature again will emerge. But of course, I don't know if and I don't know when. But we are all nature, so it's a cultural matter, and you're right. But in China, in Brazil, everywhere, we are rooted in nature. And this is something common. So the question is, how can we acknowledge these roots? Okay, and of course, in this sense, cultures are fundamental, and some cultures are completely blind. You're right. And they don't have the solution.
Simona, just one provocation. It's great to see you that you are a hopeful person. You are optimist, and I also share.
I'm not optimistic, but
your perspective. Well, at least we
don't
hope.
Have choices.
Yes, yeah. But when you talk about that we have some values as Grant, I don't think that we have. Looking at the world today with so many wars, certainly we don't have that values for Grant. And when we talk about, José brings this idea that, of course, here in Europe is one thing, but in China maybe another. We don't know much about China, we should say. And from what I know, they are doing good work there. Not so much, I don't know so much, but they are doing good work there. And so we are really a heterogeneous planet, both biologically, culturally, economically, politically. So this is for Grant. This is really for Grant. And I would like to provoke this idea that bringing Ernst Jonas to the issue, to the debate, and he was saying that we should act in a such way that our consequence or our action is compatible with the continuity of the authentic life. I don't know if we are now, each of us in this online room, able to do it. Because if we would act in this way, most probably we would not be here, first of all. And then maybe we will not eat our dinner today. And maybe we would not go to sleep in a quiet way. And so I think this is we need to face a paradox. And this is the most challenging thing, is we are living in a paradox in which we have an old narrative. We think that the problem is on the future, but is already on the present. And we are addressing ideas that somehow make us in a big conflict. We cannot hack sustainability. We can have an attitude. We can move toward that, but actually we maybe in the 70s we could act this way when people like the Meadows with the growth of limits just launched that piece of work. We could have on the 70s still some space to move in a different direction. Now we are already on the trouble in a very, very dramatic way. And that's something that we must face. I know that it does not solve our problem, but saying we should act in a sustainable way, it's a very big deal, really. It's very difficult to do it. So this is just a provocation.
No, you're right. But I remember we had already talked about this, and I answered this way that the same contradiction and the same provocation is valid also towards human beings. Because maybe, well, what we eat, the clothes we use, all the stuff we use, well, are also based on the work, for example, of children, of other human beings. Well, I said before, we don't have slavery anymore legally, but slavery exists again. So how many clothes we use? So I think this is from China. Who knows how it is done some months ago, some years ago. And what I want to say is that what you say is okay, is right, but it also concerns human beings. So it also concerns anthropocentric ethics. Ethics practically is always a contradiction. Okay, ethics practically always implies that we have an ideal and we have to maintain the gaze towards that ideal, but the practical currents is maybe impossible. Surely in this world is impossible. So my goal is not to say we have to be perfect towards the environment. Well, we are not even perfect towards other human beings. My goal is simply to learn to be not indifferent towards the environment. This should be a first step, because I think that now the problem is the indifference. The environment hasn't become yet an ethical object. So gradually something is changing, but we still tend to consider nature as a background of our actions. So we know many things, but as feelings, we haven't changed yet. And this is the challenge. Once we change in our feelings, this doesn't mean that we will be practically perfect, but we are not perfect also towards human beings. So you're right, but unfortunately, also in this case, I have not a solution.
I think George wants to bring something also.
No, I was thinking that when we imagine that 14 years of environmental education has very weak consequences, because the same person that was educating on environment use is now the one that is consuming so much. At the same time, you have this childhood problem of environmental distress. That when children acquire some understanding of the environmental crisis, they are very often depressed, and they realize how difficult it was to solve the problem. But at the same time, you see in a few years, the same children turn to a virtual world through digital articulations and live without this kind of experience. So they are able to digitalize their own fears on monsters, on the wars, on the consuming. So this is very interesting that the adults now are choosing for goals of tourism, artificial countries, artificial landscapes. So they decided to live in a world there is no problem of concerning environmental. This is my first comment. The second comment is very interesting what is happening around the seashores of Iberia with the attacks of orcas. This is very interesting things. And so you know that many yachts and ships have been attacked by orcas. So it's around the Portuguese coast, the Spanish Mediterranean and Asturian coast, there is several attacks. So the owners of the yachts as avoid to go to sea, just so they just avoid because they don't know what will happen, or when they know that, because there is a case of a Flemish couple that want in the yacht, and they are so afraid that so they are sailing so near the coast that the waves took them to the beach, and they just drowned. Everyone was destroyed. So this is very interesting things that we don't have the sense of the intellectual structure that we are observed by animals, and you are observed by other kind of watcher. You are not alone in this earth. And this is very interesting because you have the same idea in the Feral project by Janet Singh and the other researchers. So if now Feral project is quite an aesthetical and scientific project. It's very beautiful. Is connecting science, field research, aesthetics. But when we start to really understand what is going on, is very scary. It's very scary. And we understand that there is so many other ways that we understand that the non-humans are really acting and not concerning with the human survivals. So we have these zoonoses, so this disease that is contaminated by from the animals to humans. We have transformations of ecosystem by the ships that came from Asia to Europe, who have transplantations of plants. And this is not something new. It's not just after the age of discovery. It starts just long ago, but it was, I think, multiplied in the age of discoveries. And from now we have this constant, and the world is completely feral. It's not something that we can control. We really don't control nature, and nature is a certain time a control, and in the other way is controlling us. So probably this kind of educations on this ferocity of the nature, revenge, has already been treated on many films. I remember one was Event by Salmanian, I call this Samayalan. This is an American director of Indian ascendants that has made this kind of that trees just stop and poison the atmosphere. So this is something that is going on, this sense of vulnerability, fragility, and revenge. Could this help to have a more active attitude towards the non-human entities? I really don't know. But we are not just going slowly. We are now regressing. We are going back in our goals to have a sustainability environment. We are going back. The goals of diminishing the pollution, the goals of starting of increasing the global temperature. Now they are not just postponed; they are just forget. So this is very dramatic. With the war and the wars, the multiple wars, will this go on? So it's like the sense of moderations and the balance. It is now also a problem that is really will go on for the next decades. So I'm sorry, I'm very pessimistic about that. And at the same time say probably these non-human ethics will be very different that we are expecting. Will be a feral ethics. What is a feral ethics? That is depending on something that we really don't know what will happen with on these feral ecologies.
George, I will introduce the students to the Feral Atlas in the next week.
I would like, but I'm very, it's not easy.
But just one point before Simona and maybe another student also provide some question. There was no proof that the orcs attacked the sailors and the boats. It seems that they were gaming. They were playing, not attacking. So we should be careful about that. It was not an attack.
Okay, Maria, from many of the boats that were sick, they have a different opinion. I know some of them that have this problem with the gaming, because when this is a game or is an attack, when we are gaming, just when I was young, I remember to learn to shoot to birds. It was kind of a gaming, but I was really killing birds. You see, I was really killing birds, but I was just preparing to have some training in a weapon. So from gaming and to war, as you know, as you see, sports is a kind of war.
Simona. Well, we will finish within a few minutes. I don't want to overlong the section, but Simona and maybe some student or some other person would like to come with a real question.
Well, I subscribe what George has said. We have already talked about these topics in these days in which we met in Evora. Since he mentioned animals as well, I have to add that, well, of course, when we speak about our relationships to non-human, we think about ecosystems and species and organisms and individual animals and so on. And I find right that we have this holistic and layered conception. But as I have also said on Monday during a conference in Lisbon, it's important when we have to choose, when we have to act, it's also important to have clear the own hierarchy. And this is also valid in the political context, of course, because, for example, an animal, so you are defending animals, of course, but in this case, I would have a question. Do you defend an animal as individual animal? So because you are thinking about the right of that animal, or because you are thinking about the pain of that animal, or you are thinking about the animal as example of a species, or you are thinking about the animal as a moment of a bigger balance? So what are you thinking about? And I think this is important when we have to choose, or at least in the situations in which we are obliged to choose, okay? Because there are also situations in which we have to say, yes, it's okay to kill an animal, or no, because I want to kill the animal as such. So that's why I would have this question also for you, because I know that you are people fighting for the rights of nature, no human, and so on. So if you talk about animals, how do you think about them and about their rights and so on? Animals, or animals as organism, or example of species, or moments of an ecosystem, which is your axiological framework, so to say? I don't know. This is the provocation.
You are the one that raised the question now.
Now, yes. To you, or well, also to students, I don't know, but it's interesting to understand this, because as said, I am agreed that we always intend all the elements of nature, but there are situations in which we have to choose, okay? If we don't have to choose, it's better, but in some situations we have to, and in those situations it's important to have an hierarchy, a personal hierarchy, an axiological hierarchy. That's why I ask the question to the ecologist. So I don't know, it's just a provocation.
Who wants to answer? Mariana,
also student.
The students. Madalena was raising the hand, but also Deborah, Catarina, Jose. Well, no one wants to answer.
I don't know how to answer. Otherwise, I would, but I don't know how. But I think that maybe the main. I don't know. I'm going to maybe answer with another question. I think because
question against question.
Yeah, because does our mental construction, for example, or our perspective about an animal or a situation, for example, if I review myself in this animal, I'm introducing a human perspective, or I'm visualizing a human. So does this mean that is a selfish point of view? And does the ethical change, or if my answer, I don't know how to explain it.
No,
But I think you're getting the point
understood.
of what I'm trying
understood.
to ask.
Yes, okay.
So I think that does it make more correct, or does it make more genuine my answer, or my willing to protect the animal if I'm reviewing myself in it? I don't know.
No, okay, because you have said is it maybe a selfish perspective? Not necessarily. And in this respect, in philosophy, we distinguish between anthropocentric view or humanistic view. So an anthropocentric view is a view, an ethical view, in which you do something for the animal, for example, but not really for the animal, not because you acknowledge in the animal an intrinsic value, but because that animal is useful for you. I don't know, you have a cow and you are so calm with the cow, but because you want to eat your cow, okay, for example. This is an anthropocentric view. The perspective you mentioned is not anthropocentric, it's simply humanistic. So you mean the way in which I behave to the animal, for example, is a human way. So it's obvious that I reveal myself to the animal. It's obvious that I interpret the animals through human categories, to human feelings, and so on. This is obvious. This is obvious. We are humans. We always start from a human point of view. We always start from human biological predispositions, from human culture. So this is not the challenge. Of course, we can, and that's the reason why I don't believe that the extreme hypothesis, or which is the word in English, hybridization, okay, I say this, hybridization, are so useful, because it's impossible to feel okay, the same with an animal or with nature and so on. But this is not the challenge. The challenge is not a poetic fusion with nature. The challenge is, from a human point of view, because we are humans, to develop an experience which is consequent with our being rooted in the world. This is the challenge. And this is not anthropocentric. And this is not selfish, if it is cultivated in a genuine way, in my opinion. So I don't know if I have answered in a clear way.
Well, I think you have, but at least I think we need to put an end on this section, which I regret deeply, because it's very interesting. We would have a lot of things to talk about, but I don't want to overcome the period for the section. People will also have other things to do, and we have run quite well through the section. So I again acknowledge Simona lecture. It was very interesting, Simona. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks to all of you also for the discussion and for being here. Thank you.
We will invite you for another lecture concerning other issues that were
of course
brought here. So one of these days, if you agree, we will have you again.
I am one of you now. I feel part of the community of Évora.
We are already with you.
Yeah, we are exactly.
Okay. Well, obrigada a todos.
Obrigada
a nós.
Thank you, Simona.
Obrigado. Obrigado.
Obrigada. Muito
obrigada.
Obrigada.
Bye.
Bye.
E aqui ficamos